In the summer of 1889, a team of 18 surveyors, led by a seasoned engineer named Jonathan Drake, ventured deep into the heart of the Ouachita Ridge, a remote expanse known for its thick forests and untold secrets. The task seemed straightforward: mark the boundaries for a new land survey that would open up the area for new settlers and industry. But the journey into the ridge was anything but simple. The group could feel the weight of the land pressing against them, as if the earth itself was watching, waiting. Their hearts raced with anticipation, but also with a growing unease. The trees towered above them like silent sentinels, and the air grew unnaturally still. A storm was on the horizon, but they pressed forward, eager to complete their work and reap the rewards promised by the project. As the surveyors gathered around their campfire on the evening before setting out to mark the final boundaries, Jonathan addressed the group with a heavy tone. He reminded them of the significance of their mission, emphasizing that their success would lead to great fortune. But before they ventured further, he insisted that they swear an oath, one that would bind them together in secrecy about the land they were about to encounter. The oath was simple. They would not speak of what they saw, what they heard, or what they felt within the ridge, for fear that their discoveries would forever alter the course of history. With solemn expressions, the men raised their hands, swearing their allegiance to each other and the land they were marking. The forest surrounding them seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if the trees themselves were listening to the vow. The wind, which had been quiet just moments before, suddenly picked up, rustling the branches above them with a whispered warning. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but remained steadfast in their commitment. The words spoken that night would bind them not just to the land, but to something far darker. As the oath was completed, the air around them thickened, and for a brief moment, every single one of them felt it, the feeling of being watched, of something unseen lurking just beyond the tree line. The tension in the group was palpable, but they had made their vow. There was no turning back now. The next morning, the group set out into the dense wilderness, the mist still clinging to the trees and the air heavy with anticipation. The forest, once silent, now seemed to whisper in the breeze, as if the land was calling to them, urging them deeper into its grasp. As they made their way through the dense underbrush, the surveyors marked their boundaries, their instruments steady in their hands. But the unease continued to grow. With every step they took, the atmosphere around them seemed to change, growing thicker, darker, as if the very earth beneath their feet was alive and pulling them in. They could hear the distant crack of tree branches and the low rustle of something moving in the shadows. But whenever they turned, there was nothing there, just the oppressive silence that seemed to stretch on forever. By the time they reached the highest point of the ridge, where they were meant to mark the final boundary, a storm began to build. The air became charged with energy, and the sky darkened to an unnatural shade. A strange hum filled the air, vibrating through their bones. It was then that they felt it. The earth seemed to tremble, a subtle shift beneath their feet, as if the land itself was alive and waking from a long slumber. It was as if they had crossed a line, one that could never be undone. But the surveyors, bound by their oath, pressed on, marking their boundaries as the storm broke above them. Little did they know, the land had already begun to claim them, and the true test of their oath was just beginning. The second night in the Ouachita Ridge was unlike the first. As the group huddled around the campfire, a cold wind swept through the trees, causing the flames to flicker and dance erratically. Strange sounds echoed through the forest, whispers carried on the wind, like voices in a language they couldn't understand. Some of the men, their nerves frayed by days of unsettling silence, swore they saw fleeting figures darting between the trees, but when they looked, there was nothing there. The air grew heavier with each passing hour, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The once serene landscape now felt alive, its dark corners filled with an unseen menace. They had all heard the stories about the Ouachita Ridge, the cursed land that had claimed the lives of settlers in the past, but they had dismissed them as mere superstition. That was before they felt it. Now, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. On the fourth morning, the group gathered for their usual briefing, but one man was missing. Thomas, the youngest of the surveyors, had disappeared overnight without a trace. There were no signs of struggle, no broken branches or footprints, not even a hint of where he might have gone. His blanket was undisturbed, his tools left neatly by the fire, and his lanterns still hanging in the tree. Panic set in as the others searched the perimeter, calling out his name, but the forest remained eerily silent. The dense underbrush and thick canopy provided no clues, and the more they searched, the more unsettling it became. It was as if Thomas had simply vanished into thin air. The group's sense of dread deepened, but they pressed on, unable to bring themselves to leave the ridge. The oath they had sworn weighed heavily on their hearts. As the hours stretched into the afternoon, the unease among the surveyors grew. Some spoke in hushed tones, whispering about the land's curse, how settlers and travelers who ventured too deep into the ridge had never returned. The stories were well known in the nearby towns, but they had been dismissed as legends, mere cautionary tales. But now, with Thomas gone, the group couldn't ignore the growing sense that the land was more than just land. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the wind carried the scent of something ancient and decayed. There was a palpable sense of wrongness in the air, a feeling that no one could escape, no matter how hard they tried. Yet, despite their fear, no one dared suggest leaving. The pact they had made bound them to the ridge, and they couldn't break it. Not now, not after what had already happened. By nightfall, the remaining surveyors had huddled together, their nerves raw, the fire casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the forest floor. They sat in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts, the weight of Thomas's disappearance settling like a stone in their hearts. The wind howled through the trees, and the whispers returned louder now, as though the forest itself was calling to them. Each man felt a pull, a desire to venture deeper into the woods, to uncover whatever it was that had taken Thomas. But they knew better than to act on it. The oath they had taken still held them captive, a bond that kept them rooted to the land. The tension was thick, and as they lay down to sleep, the uneasy feeling that something was wrong gnawed at them. Thomas's absence was only the beginning. The ridge had claimed its first victim, and the rest of them would not be far behind. The following morning, the group discovered something that would only add to their dread, a small trail of broken branches leading off into the dense forest. It was as if Thomas had walked into the woods willingly, but there were no footprints, no signs of a struggle, no indication of where he might have gone. It was as if he had simply disappeared into the trees, swallowed whole by the ridge itself. The men stared at the trail in silence, their fear mounting with each passing second. The curse they had dismissed before now felt all too real. Thomas's disappearance was no longer an isolated incident, it was a warning. And as they continued on their journey, they couldn't shake the feeling that the ridge was not just a place, but a living thing, something that fed on the lost and the broken, and that it was watching them, waiting for them to make the wrong move. The days that followed Thomas's disappearance were filled with a growing sense of dread. The surveyors, once a tight-knit group, began to unravel. Some became silent and withdrawn, their faces gaunt with exhaustion and fear. Others, like Samuel and Elias, became frantic, their minds teetering on the edge of madness as the isolation of the Ouachita Ridge took its toll. Every creak of a branch, every rustling of leaves seemed to amplify their anxiety. It was as if the forest itself had become a living, breathing thing, its very presence gnawing at the edges of their sanity. The winds would pick up at night, howling through the trees with an unnatural force, making the men jump at every gust. The once serene ridge now felt suffocating, as if something was closing in around them. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the group came across something that none of them could explain. Deep in the forest, they discovered a strange, circular formation of large stones. They were arranged with a meticulous precision that seemed impossible for nature to have accomplished on its own. The stones, worn and weathered by time, had an eerie, otherworldly feel. Some of them were covered in deep, jagged carvings, symbols that seemed to shift and change as the men approached. The markings on the stones pulsated faintly, as if they were alive. The deeper they looked, the more the symbols seemed to move, rearranging themselves in patterns that defied logic. They tried to shake off the cold fear creeping up their spines, but it was impossible to ignore. As they stood there, trying to make sense of what they were seeing, the air around them grew heavier, and a cold mist began to seep up from the ground. The feeling of being watched intensified. It was no longer just the oppressive silence of the forest. It felt as though the trees themselves were alive, their twisted branches reaching out to entangle them. Each surveyor exchanged uneasy glances, their faces pale, their hearts pounding in their chests. Something was terribly wrong, and no one could explain why. They instinctively stepped back from the stone circle, but the pull of the land seemed to draw them in further. Every step they took felt as though they were walking deeper into the heart of something dark and ancient. The group tried to ignore the strange sensation that had settled over them, but it was impossible to escape. As they made camp that night, the whispers began, low guttural growls that seemed to echo through the trees. At first, they thought it was the wind, but the sounds were too distinct, too deliberate. The growls grew louder and more frequent, until it felt as though something large was moving just beyond their sight. The men lay awake, their eyes darting nervously around the camp, the shadows growing longer with each passing minute. The trees swayed in the wind, but it was as if they were moving in rhythm with the sounds, creating a sense of unnatural movement in the woods. The forest was not just alive, it was aware of them, and it was closing in. The night was filled with strange noises, branches snapping, the distant howl of something unknown, the rustling of unseen creatures just out of reach. Every surveyor felt a deep, bone-chilling unease, a sense that something was lurking just beyond the edge of the campfire's light. As the hours dragged on, the growls intensified, rising in pitch until it felt as though they were surrounded by something much larger than themselves. It was as if the land itself was speaking, communicating through the darkness, through the trees. Some of the men tried to rationalize the sounds, telling themselves it was just wildlife, but deep down, they knew better. They had crossed a line, and the forest was no longer indifferent. It was hostile. By the fourth night, the group's nerves were stretched thin. Every movement seemed amplified, every shadow seemed threatening. As they prepared to leave the ridge, they began to hear something else. Whispers, faint and indistinct, riding the wind. They couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, pleading. The whispers seemed to come from the trees, from the ground itself, as though the very forest was trying to communicate with them. Some of the men swore they heard their names being called. Others heard the names of those who had disappeared. The air grew thick with an oppressive weight, and the forest felt suffocating, as though it was alive with unseen forces. Something was awakening, something old and forgotten, and it was angry. In the early hours of the morning, they found themselves at the edge of the ridge, preparing to leave, but none of them could shake the feeling that they were being followed. The forest seemed to pulse around them, the ground beneath their feet vibrating with a low hum, as though something vast and ancient was stirring below the earth. They could hear the trees creaking, bending under an invisible force, and the wind carried with it a low, mournful sound that seemed to be calling to them. The land had a mind of its own, and it was making its intentions clear. No matter how hard they tried to leave, no matter how fast they walked, it felt as though the ridge was pulling them back, refusing to let them go. It wasn't just the land they had to fear, it was the very essence of the ridge itself, alive with a malevolent force that would never let them leave. As the group finally made their way to the edge of the forest, a strange, overwhelming silence descended. The growls had stopped, the whispers ceased. But in their place was something even more unsettling, the feeling of eyes upon them, 1,000 unseen watchers in the trees. The surveyors quickened their pace, but the land still seemed to shift beneath them, as though the forest was changing, warping, closing in. Their minds were unraveling, their senses overwhelmed by the terror of being trapped in a place that had no mercy. The ridge was no longer a place of land. It was a living thing, and it would take what it had been promised, and it would never let go. By the 7th day, the remaining surveyors had begun to crumble. Of the original 18 men, only 10 were still with the group. The rest had disappeared into the vast, unforgiving woods of Ouachita Ridge, their bodies never found, only their names left behind in whispered legends. The land, it seemed, had claimed them. The survivors had become a shadow of the men they once were. Paranoia set in quickly, infecting every member of the group. Were they being stalked by something unseen, or was it simply the isolation and the oppressive weight of the land driving them to madness? The atmosphere around them had become suffocating, and every rustling branch, every distant snap of a twig felt like a warning. The lines between the natural and the unnatural were starting to blur. As the days passed, a creeping dread settled into the hearts of the men. The mental strain had become unbearable. Some swore they could hear footsteps behind them, only to turn and find no one there. Others claimed to see fleeting shadows lurking just beyond the firelight, figures moving too quickly to be human. The once brave men had become jumpy and disoriented. It wasn't just the haunting silence of the woods that unsettled them. It was the fact that nothing in the ridge made sense anymore. The familiar sounds of nature had been replaced with eerie, unnatural noises, low growls, whispers, and the unmistakable feeling that something was watching them. The ridge had become a living nightmare, a place where logic no longer applied, and the laws of nature seemed suspended. That night, as the group sat huddled around the fire, a sense of unease gripped them. The wind had died down, and a thick fog rolled in from the woods, swallowing the camp in a suffocating mist. It was then that John and Samuel, two of the stronger-willed surveyors, suddenly bolted from the camp. No words were exchanged. They simply ran into the night, leaving their equipment and comrades behind. The others shouted after them, but there was no response. It was as if the fog had consumed them whole. The fire flickered wildly as the remaining men stood in stunned silence. The eerie quiet that followed their departure was worse than any noise could have been. Something had taken hold of John and Samuel, something that couldn't be explained. In the dead of night, the remaining surveyors ventured to the edge of the camp, hoping to find any trace of the missing men. As they stood on the ridge, the thick mist swirling around them, they saw a figure in the distance. At first, it seemed like a shadow, just another trick of the fog. But as their eyes adjusted, they realized the figure was tall, unnaturally tall, and twisted, its proportions wrong, as if it had been stretched out of shape. The silhouette was so distorted, so grotesque, that it didn't seem human at all. The figure stood motionless, watching them with an unsettling calmness. No words were spoken. No movement was made, but the presence of the figure sent a wave of cold terror through the group. They called out to it, but it didn't respond. The land itself seemed to come alive in that moment. The ground beneath their feet rippled like a sudden shift in the earth. The trees groaned in response, their branches swaying unnaturally in the absence of wind. The air thickened, and the temperature dropped sharply. The forest had become a living thing, a malevolent entity that pulsed with power. The figure in the distance remained motionless, but the tension in the group escalated to unbearable levels. The surveyors, their nerves completely frayed, turned and ran, not daring to look back. The figure remained in their peripheral vision, always there, never getting closer, but somehow always watching. By the time the men returned to the camp, their faces were ashen, their minds shattered by what they had witnessed. John and Samuel had vanished without a trace, just like the others before them. They had not left footprints, not a single mark in the fog that would suggest they had ever been there. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. The remaining surveyors tried to make sense of what had happened, but the terror they had just witnessed shattered any semblance of rational thought. Their grip on reality was slipping. They could feel it. The land was alive, and it was closing in on them, inch by inch. As the night wore on, the survivors couldn't shake the feeling that the ridge had consumed more than just their companions. It had taken their sanity as well. The remaining men sat in a daze, their minds racing with the horrors they had witnessed, unable to sleep, unable to think clearly. Every noise outside the camp felt like a threat. Every shadow cast by the fire seemed to take on a life of its own. They were trapped, not just in the physical sense, but mentally. They could feel the land's influence over them, pressing down like a weight on their chests, suffocating their thoughts. It was no longer just paranoia. They were being hunted by something they couldn't understand. The next morning, the surveyors gathered their things, preparing to leave the ridge. But they knew it was too late. The land had already claimed them. The eerie presence that had lingered in the trees, the growls in the distance, and the figure that haunted them had all but shattered their spirits. The only question now was whether they could leave the ridge before the land took its final toll. As they gathered their belongings and took one last look at the fog-covered forest, they realized with growing horror that they were no longer the same men who had arrived. They were marked by the land, by something ancient and terrifying that would never let them go. The Ouachita Ridge had broken them, body and mind, and they knew deep down that the ridge would never allow them to leave. As the men gathered around the fire, their faces drawn and haggard from days of fear and exhaustion, the tension in the air was suffocating. It had been nearly a week since the last of their comrades had disappeared, and the survivors were on the verge of collapse. Each day had blurred into the next, filled with strange occurrences and growing dread. But on the sixth night, Nathaniel, the oldest of the surveyors, his eyes sunken with age and regret, finally spoke. His voice was cracked, barely above a whisper, as if speaking the truth aloud might shatter whatever fragile grip they still had on reality. "The oath," he said, his voice trembling. "It's more than just a vow to keep quiet. It's a curse." The group fell silent, their attention now fixed on him. They had all heard rumors of the land's dark history, but none of them were prepared for the revelation that followed. Nathaniel continued, his words heavy with the weight of decades of guilt. "Years ago, a group of settlers came here, much like us. They made a vow to the land, offering their souls in exchange for its power, its eternal strength. In return, the land promised them prosperity, peace, and an everlasting bond with the earth. But it was a lie. That oath, just like ours, was a trap. The settlers' souls were bound to the land, cursed to walk in the shadows, their spirits never to be free. And when we made our vow, we unknowingly sealed our fate." The others stared at him, disbelief and fear etched across their faces. The realization that they had unwittingly become part of something far darker than they had ever imagined sent a chill down their spine. The fire crackled, the flames casting long, twisted shadows over the surveyors' faces as Nathaniel's story unfolded. He explained that over the years, the land had claimed more than just the bodies of those who had ventured into the Ouachita Ridge. It had taken their spirits, twisted them, and bound them to the earth, forever tethered to the place that had consumed them. The pact, originally forged in desperation, had evolved into something more powerful than any of them had realized. The land had become sentient, aware of every soul it had claimed, and it fed off the fear and suffering of those who dared enter its grasp. The spirits of the original settlers now haunted the ridge, their whispers echoing through the trees, always watching, always waiting for the next victims to make the same fatal mistake. Nathaniel's voice grew more strained as he spoke of the curse that had plagued them since the very moment they had sworn their oath. "We are bound to this land," he muttered, his hands trembling. "No matter what we do, no matter how far we run, the land will never let us go. If we survive, we will walk out, but at the cost of breaking our oath. The land will claim what was promised. The spirits won't allow us to leave without taking something in return." The group looked at one another, their faces pale with horror. The weight of Nathaniel's words pressed down on them like an invisible force, suffocating their every thought. They had thought they were merely trapped by the wilderness, but they were wrong. The land itself was the enemy, and it had already won. The reality of what Nathaniel had confessed settled into the hearts of the remaining surveyors like a vice. The land wasn't just a place they had trespassed upon, it was a living, breathing entity that had ensnared them with the promise of survival. Their pact had bound them in ways they couldn't have imagined. The spirits of the settlers, their faces twisted in eternal torment, now watched the group with hungry eyes, waiting for their next move. The once calm, majestic Ouachita Ridge had become a place of unimaginable horror, where the rules of life and death no longer applied. Each surveyor, struggling to maintain their sanity, realized that breaking the oath, leaving the land, would cost them dearly. There was no escape from the ridge, not for them, not for anyone. As the wind picked up, swirling through the trees and sending chills down their spines, the men knew what they had to do. Their choice was clear, but it was a choice that would forever haunt them. They had to break the oath, risk their souls being claimed by the land, or stay trapped in the nightmare forever. It was a desperate decision, one born of terror and hopelessness. But Nathaniel's confession had ignited something in the group. It wasn't just fear that gripped them anymore. It was a flicker of defiance. They couldn't accept the curse, couldn't bow to the land's malevolent power, but they knew that no matter what they chose, the ridge would not release them without a price. The hours stretched on, each man lost in his own tortured thoughts as they sat in silence, the weight of the curse settling in like an anchor around their necks. They had made a pact, unknowingly, with forces beyond their comprehension. But what would happen if they refused to honor it? Could they fight back against the very earth itself? The land's power was growing stronger, and the spirits of the settlers were becoming more aggressive, their whispers turning to anguished cries. The surveyors were at the breaking point. There was no time left to debate. The ridge was closing in on them, and soon they would have to make a choice. The oath had already broken them, but it was up to them to decide if they would break it in return. As the night dragged on, the landscape around them grew darker, the trees leaning in like sentient beings, their twisted limbs reaching toward the group. The ridge was alive, pulsing with an ancient, unholy energy. The surveyors knew the land was waiting for them to make their move. And so, one by one, they stood, each man silently accepting the truth. Their survival would come at the cost of breaking the oath, and their souls would be claimed by the very earth they had sworn to protect. As they gathered their courage to leave the camp, the spirits of the long-dead settlers seemed to rise from the ground, their hollow eyes fixated on the men. The price of their survival had never been so clear. Their oath would be their undoing. And soon they would know whether they could escape the cursed land or if the Ouachita Ridge would claim them all. The final night in the Ouachita Ridge had arrived, and with it came the inevitable culmination of the men's descent into madness. Only 4 surveyors remained. Nathaniel, the oldest, now a shell of the man he once was, Thomas's brother William, who had kept a quiet resolve throughout the ordeal, and 2 others, their faces pale, their hands trembling as they clutched their tools and weapons. They had made it this far, but now the land they had sworn to protect had turned against them. The ridge had become a living nightmare, and it felt as though every inch of earth was conspiring to drag them down into the darkness. The ground beneath their feet seemed to undulate, as though the earth itself had grown sentient, shifting and contorting with malevolent intent. The trees that had once stood tall and proud now appeared twisted and hunched, their limbs stretching unnaturally toward the men, as though reaching for their souls. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the wind carried with it a mournful wail that seemed to echo through the forest. As they stumbled forward, desperate to escape the suffocating grip of the ridge, something shifted in the earth, something old and terrible. From the ground, a figure emerged, rising slowly as if born from the soil itself. The figure was not human, but a grotesque amalgamation of tortured souls, their faces distorted in eternal agony. These were the settlers, bound to the land for eternity, their spirits now risen to claim those who dared trespass on their cursed ground. The four men froze in terror as the figure advanced, its form a shifting mass of writhing shadows and anguished faces. The land had given birth to this monstrous vision, a manifestation of its power, fueled by the suffering of all who had made the fateful pact. The spirits of the settlers reached out, their hands outstretched, their hollow eyes fixed on the surveyors with a desperate hunger. The forest itself seemed to close in around them, the roots of the trees lashing out like tendrils, coiling around their ankles and pulling them toward the earth. It was as if the land was reclaiming them, dragging them into its depths, determined to bind them to the same fate as those who had come before. With every step they took, the land responded, the very ground beneath their feet shifting to resist their progress. Panic surged through the men as they struggled against the roots, trying in vain to break free. The cries of the spirits echoed in the air, growing louder and more frantic. "Release us!" they wailed. "Release us, or you will share our fate." The words reverberated in their minds, drowning out all rational thought. The spirits had once made the same promise they had made, an oath to protect the land in exchange for power, but now they were trapped in a cycle of endless torment. And in that moment, the four surveyors realized that they were no different. The land had claimed them, and their souls would soon join the others, bound to the ridge forever. Desperation gripped Nathaniel's heart, and with a trembling hand, he raised his voice, breaking the silence. "We were wrong," he cried out, his voice ragged with guilt and fear. "We broke our oath. We betrayed you, but we never knew the price. We never knew." His words trailed off as the ground beneath them trembled, as if the very earth was reacting to his confession. The spirits seemed to pause, their ghastly forms hovering in the air for a brief moment, as if considering his words. But it was too late. The pact had been made, and the land would not forgive them. The spirits began to scream, their voices filled with rage, and the ground shook violently as the land's power reached its peak. The four men fell to their knees, the roots tightening around their legs, pulling them deeper into the earth. The spirits of the settlers circled around them, their once pleading faces now twisted with anger and betrayal. They had been trapped in this cursed land for generations, and now they would not allow the surveyors to escape their fate. With each agonizing scream, the land claimed its final price, consuming the men's souls. The forest seemed to come alive, the trees groaning as though in triumph, as the last of the surveyors were swallowed by the earth. Their bodies disappeared without a trace, and for a moment, all was still. In the aftermath, the land fell silent once more. The twisted trees, the shifting earth, and the tortured spirits faded into the mist, leaving nothing behind but the faintest whispers on the wind. The Ouachita Ridge had claimed its victims, and the cycle was complete. The land, now more powerful than ever, settled back into its eternal slumber, waiting for the next unwitting souls to stumble upon it. The ghosts of the settlers remained, their hollow eyes forever searching for a release that would never come. The ridge was their prison, just as it was now the prison of the surveyors who had dared to break their oath. The following morning, the ridge was as peaceful as it had been on the day the surveyors first arrived. But the men who had once walked its path were gone, their names lost to time. The land, though seemingly dormant, still held its dark secret, and it would continue to claim those who dared enter its borders. As the mist rolled across the ridge, the last remnants of the surveyor's journey faded away, becoming another tale whispered in the wind, another warning to those who might seek the power of the Ouachita Ridge. And as the spirits of the settlers waited, trapped in their endless torment, the land's hunger remained, unyielding and eternal. When the rescue party finally arrived on the Ouachita Ridge, days after the last distressing signs of the surveyor's disappearance, they found only empty tents, discarded equipment, and the faint smell of decay in the air. The woods, which had been alive with the sounds of anguish and terror, were now eerily silent. The once active camp was abandoned, as though the men had vanished into thin air. The only remnants of their existence were the faint impressions in the earth where they had once stood. The land, as it had done countless times before, had claimed its victims. The rescue party combed through the area, finding no traces of life, no clues as to what had happened. It was as if the surveyors had never been there at all. The silence of the ridge was deafening, the very forest seeming to hold its breath. The land had taken everything from the men, leaving behind only the mark of their failure. The ancient oath had been broken, but the consequences were clear. The price of defiance had been paid in full. The spirits of the settlers, once bound to the ridge by their own unholy pact, had now been freed, but at a terrible cost. The spirits of the surveyors, too, had joined them, their souls lost forever to the land they had once sworn to protect. The Ouachita Ridge, though seemingly at peace, had only changed in its outward appearance. The darkness that clung to it remained, waiting for the next unwitting souls to stumble upon it. Years passed, and the story of the surveyor's disappearance slowly faded into the forgotten corners of history. People spoke of the Ouachita Ridge in hushed tones, but the details of the events that transpired there grew blurry, distorted by time and fear. Yet the land remained silent and patient, as if waiting for something or someone. Those who still dared to ask about the ridge were met with cold, unblinking stares and warnings not to go near. The land had claimed its own, and no one was eager to learn its dark secrets. The ridge had become a place of legend, a place to be avoided at all costs. But for those few who ventured near, a strange presence still lingered in the air. The trees seemed to whisper secrets. The wind carried distant, mournful cries that no one could explain. It was as if the land itself held onto the memory of what had transpired, refusing to let it fade completely. The cycle of terror, the curse, was not broken. It had merely been put on hold, waiting for the next souls brave or foolish enough to enter its grasp. The Ouachita Ridge was a place where time stood still, where the echoes of the past never truly left, and where the spirits of the settlers and the surveyors walked side by side, forever bound to the land. The ghosts, restless and hungry, continued to haunt the ridge, their wails carried by the wind. They had been freed, but their torment had not ended. They were caught in an eternal limbo, waiting for something they could never attain. No matter how much time passed, they remained, trapped between the world of the living and the land they had betrayed. It was a cruel irony. The very souls who had once sought to protect the land had now become its prisoners, bound by the very pact they had made. The Ouachita Ridge had no mercy, and the land's hunger could never be satisfied. In the nearby towns, the old stories of the surveyor's disappearance still circulated, though few believed them. Those who did, however, whispered that the land would always claim those who dared enter its borders, just as it had claimed the surveyors. The Ouachita Ridge was not just a place, it was a force, one that would never release its grip on the souls it had captured. And though the ridge may have been silent now, there were still those who said they could hear the faint echoes of the past on the wind, as if the land was calling out to the living, beckoning them to join the ranks of the lost. As time passed, the Ouachita Ridge became a place of forbidden mystery. It was no longer just a land, but a warning, one whispered to travelers, to those daring enough to seek out its secrets. But even in its silence, the ridge's power remained, waiting. The spirits that wandered its twisted trees and hollowed ground could not rest. The curse, it seemed, was eternal, its grip unbreakable. The jurors' oath had been shattered, but the consequences were far from over. And as the land continued to claim the souls of the foolish and the curious, the ridge waited for its next victims. The curse would never end, and the spirits would never be freed. The story of the Ouachita Ridge had become a chilling reminder, passed down through the generations. No one would ever again venture into the heart of the ridge, and no one would question the land's power. The land had claimed its final toll, The spirits, now part of the earth itself, would haunt the ridge for eternity. No matter how many years passed, the land would remain unyielding and powerful, forever calling to those who would dare to listen.